Okay, thanks everybody for being here. This has been a great conversation so far. And I'd like to continue that by talking about performance over the platform of Twitch TV, the performance of gameplay. So to give some context for this, here is a sample of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about streaming on Twitch. In the center of the screen here, we can see that somebody is broadcasting gameplay. In this case, they're broadcasting Mario Kart 8, I believe. In this lower left-hand corner of this broadcast, there is actually the streamer themselves. They are talking to chat, which is over there on the right-hand side of the screen. There's a back and forth conversation, so they might be responding to something that's said in chat. The chat itself is having its own conversation. I don't know if you guys can see it, but they're talking about video game consoles that they had when they were kids. And also, this is all part of a designed experience. So there's a header and an avatar. At the bottom, below the gameplay, there is informational panels to talk about schedule, about the streamer themselves. And the gameplay is framed by a thing that's designed in a similar fashion. So this all has a similar theme. The streamer is using like a galaxy theme for all of their graphics. So this has been considered previously, just to talk about a little bit of related work in a couple different contexts. One of those contexts is focusing on the audience and the spectators. Kai has a lot of good work about this. One example is Bill Hamilton's work that conceptualizes the chat as a third place, as a community. That's from Kai 2014. Huang and Chung have looked at this in terms of the motivations of spectatorship in stream gameplay. There's also been work that focuses on the streamers. A couple of good papers about this are Hector Postigo's work. He looks at YouTube, but it basically looks at the labor of putting this together. Also, Kashana Gray, she looks at the intersectionality of streaming on Twitch, especially in terms of women of color who stream on Twitch. I would say that my work builds on this previous work in considering the whole stream as a performative act. So the way that I'm looking at this is through the approach of field analysis. This comes from sociology, from the work of Pierre Bourdieu, and it looks at delimited or bounded social activities as a field. In this case, we can think of the field as streaming on Twitch. So there's a couple different elements to this. One of those elements is the habitus, or the dispositions and taken for granted meanings that somebody uses to approach participating in a field. There are individuals and also groups who exchange flows of capital, so different types of power, different types of resources and materials within a field. And the goal of field analysis, I would say, is really to understand relationships of power and positionality within a field. So expand a little bit on flows of capital. Our paper focuses on three in particular. There's economic or material capital, really like the money and the material resources that exist within the field. There's cultural capital, which are the skills and also the tastes that position you within the field. And there's also symbolic capital, which is a little bit harder to define, but it's kind of the immaterial or less concrete forms of recognition within a field, prestige, for example. We don't talk about this directly in the paper, but another important aspect of this would be social capital, so the benefits that you get from your social network, for example. And another example of this might be like educational capital. The benefits you get from your education would be an example of that as well. So this derives two research questions for the study. How do streamers conceive of what they do when they stream gameplay? And what practices are involved in becoming an avid and accepted streamer? I think really what we're getting at with these questions is how do people conceive of what they do when they stream, and what practices are involved in putting a stream together? So to approach this, we use constructivist grounded theory analysis of an online space dedicated to streaming. We focused on a site called streamplus.com. This has been anonymized to protect participant identities. That was chosen for its active conversation between veterans and new streamers. So new streamers will come in, they'll kind of ask questions, and there'll be an active conversation between people who have been streaming for a while and the new streamers about what it means to actually do this work, to put out this artifact. So this is why we chose it, because it directly relates to our research questions. So through analysis, we looked at 240 threads. This was from January to August of 2016, totaling 1,895 posts altogether. These were from 116 individual authors, I would say about 30 of which were actually regulars on the forum. So in doing this analysis, we reached four major findings. Streams consist of three interrelated activities. The first is assembling technology, there's building community, and there's also adopting a gameplay persona. These activities are mediated and moderated by different types of metrics that are available on the system, both quantified and also intangible metrics. So to go over these in detail, when we consider assembling technology, really what we're talking about is putting together the media artifact of the stream. So there's layout and design. This guy plays retro games. He plays older games, so he's kind of styled his channel to match. He has this old-fashioned TV border around his gameplay. If you scroll down a little bit, his informational panels, so the things that exist below the gameplay itself, they're styled in a similar way. There's this pixelated font. There's a 16-bit cityscape in the background. He's also putting together physical hardware. So this is being run on a computer that's capturing gameplay. He is capturing his image through a camera, and he's wearing headphones. All of this has to be configured to talk to one another in order to put together this artifact. And that's done through software, in this case, Open Broadcast System. This is like an AV panel that basically assembles all of this together, puts it into a single cohesive experience for the audience. So speaking of the audience, second major avenue of the practice was building community. This is basically building up your viewership on the platform. The people on Stream Plus thought of this across three different forms of activity. The first is networking. So there are formal ways this happens in Twitch. You can follow people or subscribe them. If you follow them, you get a notification when they go live, and followers are also like a metric that people measure in the system. Subscription is pretty similar. There's money involved in subscription, but it serves a similar function to the following. But I think really in Stream Plus, when they were talking about networking, what they were talking about is just being present in somebody's chat, being part of their community, interacting, having fun, with the idea that it might be reciprocated later in your stream later. So there's also branding. We kind of talked about this in the last slide, but the idea is having a consistent look between all the elements of your stream. So we can see that there's, once again, the 16-bit cityscape in the background, the pixelated graphics. This kind of relates to this person's identity as a streamer of retro, older games. This also expands out to other spaces you might be involved in, so spaces interacting. So you might also be on YouTube, you might be on Reddit, you might be on Twitter and Tumblr. And all of these tend to have not only a consistent visual design between them, but also the same sort of persona, personality, and identity between the spaces as well. So moving on, so even though we kind of expanded these into three different categories for the purpose of analysis and discussion, really the way that this was conceptualized within the space was as interrelated practice. So to pull from our data, we have a quote here. Just for a little bit of context, this comes from somebody who's what's called a variety streamer. They're playing lots of different games with lots of different genres, and they're expressing frustration in how they are having trouble building up an audience through this type of streaming. So a more senior member of the forum comes in, and they give this advice. They say, once you build up a community of a dozen or so regulars who are always there regardless of the game, you'll be in a good position where moving game to game isn't so bad, because those regulars help to give you visibility in the category. So we have kind of a secondary benefit apart from just having viewership. We also have the ability that when you go into a new game, you're not starting with 0 viewers, you're starting with 12 instead. Another example of a secondary benefit would be community moderation. So a lot of the moderation that happens on Twitch is actually through the community. Having a strong community and having moderators within this community actually helps to defer harassment and trolling in Twitch. So I'd say that the most important aspect of the practice is adopting a gameplay attitude, and I think what I would argue is maybe the performative aspect of this. This is often posited as being important because Twitch is very competitive. There are, for example, these are the top 6 games that were being streamed when I was creating this presentation. Unsurprisingly, League of Legends is at the top there. It has about 100,000 people watching at that time. If we go into the category further, we can see that about a quarter of those are in the top stream. And then if we go across the top 8 streams, we see that about half of the viewership that's on League of Legends is happening in these top streams. If we scroll down a little bit, hypothetically, there we go. If we scroll down a little bit, we can see just how competitive this is. These are all within the first 100 streams, they still have hundreds of viewers. If you're coming into this with 0 to 2 viewers, then it can be daunting. It can feel like you're not really making any progress, like you're not building your audience, essentially. So to mediate against that, a common bit of advice is like this quote here. This comes from a pretty common genre thread where somebody mentions that they feel like they're stagnating, like they're not growing their viewership. A more senior member of the forum gives this advice. They say, your mindset before hitting that stream button is important. You're about to sit down and play a game. That's always something that should be positive. Games are supposed to be fun. So focusing on the fun of play, on the fun of interacting with your audience, and the joy of actually streaming is sort of a way to remediate the feeling of stagnation, of being in a super competitive environment. However, that's not really what the viewer is seeing when they're looking at their dashboard and even when they're looking at the viewership numbers below their screen. What they're seeing is a constant quantification of their viewership. This actually plays out in economic terms in the way of partnership. Partnership is where Twitch will share advertising revenue with the streamer. And that's decided on a couple different qualities, but mostly those qualities are your viewership numbers. So there's a definite tension between gaining viewership and having fun, enjoying yourself, and hanging out. I would argue actually that the fun, enjoyment, hanging out aspect is sort of like a form of symbolic capital. It's sort of intangible, but it can confer later benefits for the streamer. So to conclude, we put this into a visual model. So we have adopting a gameplay persona. I would argue the performance aspect of this as one of the central aspects of the practice. This is going to determine what sort of technology you assemble. It's going to determine so for example, if you're speedrunning a game, if you're going through a game as fast as possible, if you're playing competitively, that's going to have entirely different technology than if you're just kind of like kicking back, drinking beers, and like riffing on a game that you're playing. In a similar fashion, the community that you build through either one of these genres is going to be completely different from each other. And all this can be interrupted by trolling. So unfortunately, trolling is fairly prevalent on Twitch. Taking time out of your stream to deal with the negative aspects of harassment, or having a negative vibe in your channel because of harassment can definitely interfere with the ability of a person to adopt a gameplay persona and to actually construct their stream. So all of these behaviors are being determined by metrics. Do you care about the gaining viewership? Do you care about the fun, enjoyment, and hanging out? The truth is you probably care a little bit about both, but your major focus in the stream is going to determine what kind of artifact you put out there for the public. So from this, we come to two design considerations for both for changing current streaming systems and designing new streaming systems. The first is to rethink metrics. Right now, the viewership metrics are at the forefront, but what if we change this to think about the more symbolic, less concrete metrics that were posited as being important in the Stream Plus space? I would argue that if we do this, then we might get different types of streams out there. Another aspect of this is, or the other design consideration is community moderation. The people who are less likely to have the strong community that is able to mitigate against trolling are also the people who might be marginalized by a wider game culture. They might not have the cultural capital within game culture to attract an audience right away. So if they go in there and they're trolled or harassed, then they're not going to have the community moderation to prevent against that. We argue that in addition to thinking about automatic or automated modes of moderation, we could also think about this in terms of maybe changing the culture of Twitch or maybe changing higher level moderation strategies on Twitch. So I think that we have a couple next steps from those conclusions. One of those, which is in progress, this is part of a larger dissertation study, is to investigate our model with ethnographic perspectives. So we have 7 different streamers that we've kind of used to examine the practice. People from different backgrounds with different goals for streaming, and with different types of positions within the field of game culture. I think that we also could consider different spaces. Stream Plus is fairly open, it's fairly non-hierarchical, it's fairly not elitist. So we might consider that against more closed off spaces, against spaces which privilege, instead of this idea of having fun and enjoying yourself, really gaining viewership metrics. How would that change the habitus of individuals who are participating in these different spaces? And I think also a really important aspect of this is to investigate the flows of capital. We do this a little bit in our paper. We make some suggestions about the different forms of capital that we're seeing in our analysis. But I think that it really makes sense to do a wider scale survey and maybe social network analysis approaches to this in order to understand how cultural capital translates into economic capital, how the social capital of streamers also plays out in these ways. Okay, I want to say thank you to everybody for watching. Thank you to all the other panelists. It was a great discussion. And thanks to June, my advisor, for helping me with this as well, for helping me write the paper and really helping me to think through this project. All right, thank you so much.
Hi, Jason Yip from the University of Washington. So we're seeing like companies now seeing streaming on kind of positive, negative, with Persona 5, a game that came out from Atlas. Atlas says that you're not allowed to stream up to a certain date point in this game. So what are your thoughts now that companies control the way streaming happens and how it changes performative play, or if it does change performative play in your mind?
That's a good question. That's also something that we see in the data as well, is the idea that companies interact with streamers a lot. So I think the Persona 5 is a good example of the way that a company might kind of cut off streaming in order to protect like the, I guess you'd call it like spoilers of the game. You also see companies advertising, so they'll give away stream keys to streamers, and I think that often the companies try to kind of match like the type of game to like the brand that the streamer has as well. So I think that there is definitely more work to be done there, and I think it is something that we're seeing that we could probably observe in future research as well.
Hi, Yvette Wan, New Jersey Institute of Technology. Really interesting talk. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the streamers that you were studying, and whether a lot of the discussion points that you made seem to be kind of oriented towards professional streamers, and there's a large gap between those who garner large viewerships and then the smaller streams, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So I think that one of the major findings from the ethnographic work is actually that we have a couple of people who are like more professional, like they're actually like treating this like a serious hobby, I guess. We also have people who are sort of just using this as a hangout spot. So they're importing their pre-existing social networks into their audience, and they're just using this as a way to like sort of like game on the couch almost. So I think that there is a big difference in that approach, and that's definitely something that we'd like to look at in future research is if that difference exists, kind of how that plays out in the stream artifact itself.
Hi, I'm Robin Taylor from Newcastle University. I was really interested in this because this is a community that I know nothing about. This idea of playing video games, and they were literally streaming their own faces while they were playing, so they knew they had a webcam on their face while they played the game. So I was wondering from your work with people, how were the people dividing their attention between putting on a performance for their watchers and actually playing the game themselves? Do you notice like a strong variance between how much sort of outright performativity is going on versus how many people are paying more attention to acing the game? I mean, how do they balance that?
That's a really great question. So I think that this is kind of like a question of genre. There's a bunch of different genres of performance on here. If you're playing a fast-paced game, so like one of my ethnographic participants plays Counter-Strike, which is a fast-paced shooter. She has to wait until she has died in the game or has stopped playing in order to interact with the chat. I also have a group of people who are a team of streamers, so they usually have two people playing the game, and then one person actually takes over that role of reading the chat and interacting.
Oh, right. It's interesting just because I can imagine it must be hard to maintain attention on if you want to be more sort of deliberate in your actions rather than just reacting as a normal player. Thank you so much. That was a very interesting interpretation of performance in this context. So.
Thank you.